Hello guys, welcome to module number 9 of CADS 3853. In this module, we are going to learn how to average different markups we apply to different merchandise groups and calculate the average markup percent. Although we may decide on our initial markup plan, we may not apply the same initial markup percent on every item that we purchase. There are many different reasons why we may apply varying markups on different merchandise. The first reason may be the variation in the cost and the price line policy. The price line policy basically means that a store or retailer will determine a certain set of price points for a category of merchandise. For example, for all t-shirts in this store, let's say we are going to either have a t-shirt that is $5 or $9 or $14. So those three price points are determined. And we try to purchase the different t-shirts that would be applicable to this $5, $9, or $14 price points. When we go out to the market to purchase these different t-shirts to fulfill these different price lines or price points merchandise needs, sometimes, let's say we may buy t-shirts that are like costing $5 or $6 or $7, and maybe we decided all of these t-shirts at different costs will be applicable for the $9 price points to be sold in our store. In that case, we're using the same retail price, but their costs were varying. Some of the t-shirts were $5, some of the t-shirts were $6, some of the t-shirts were $9, etc. $7, etc. So it is basically when you have a specific retail price points that you already decide and you're trying to purchase for these price points, you're not going to exactly pay the same unit cost for every item that you're buying to fulfill this price point merchandise line. In that case, what's going to happen is you may end up applying a different markup percentage across these different groups of merchandise, although their retail price will be the same. So although you may have the initial markup plan that you initially kind of planned out, you may sometimes apply a little bit higher markup on certain items and a little bit lower markup on certain items because of the variation in the price the cost of these different merchandise groups, and maybe they are still needing to be sold at the same retail price in that kind of case. Another potential cause of different markups will be item characteristics. For example, fashionable items versus basic items. Which type of items do you think are going to require a higher markup percentage? It will be fashionable items, because the very fashion forward items, there are more risk involved because we're not sure how many people will actually buy. There's unpredictability, whereas basic items, it's more, the sales or demands are more predictable, so you can apply pretty much kind of stable kind of markup percent. But fashionable items, it's unpredictable, it may work well or it may not work at all, so for that reason you want to apply a little bit higher markups to compensate for the potential failure in selling it well in your store. In the same sense, any other kind of risky items, because of the characteristic of the merchandise, you always would like to apply a little bit higher markup. Exclusive items. Exclusive items basically mean these are the kind of items that are only available in your store. No competitors around you have these items. That means you can have a little bit more liberty in deciding on the markup, because consumers are not going to be able to do a comparison shopping, right? They cannot compare your price against other competitors' prices. So you can apply a little bit higher markup on these kind of items. Items that require more care, more cleaning care, or you have to add some plastic covering or sacks to be able to protect it from getting dusted or dirtied or getting stained by customers touching them, things like that, such as like forecourts, usually you need to care a little bit more about it. All those kind of things that add more expenses for preparing the merchandise for sale, that will add to the cost of goods sold. So beyond the initial build cost that you have to pay to the vendor, you may end up paying additional workroom costs that you have to for you to be able to maintain the quality of the merchandise. For those kind of merchandise items, you would like to add a little bit higher markup so that you can afford to pay for those expenses for additional care. So for all these characteristics lead to a higher markup percentage requirement. On the other hand, competition, right? If you have a high competition and you're dealing with items that are very similar to your competitors' items, in that case, that right away leads to your customers comparison shopping, right? You're not the only store they can buy a similar kind of items. In that case, you will have to lower the markup. Sometimes you might be getting into this price competitiveness, so that you have to lower your markup so that to be able to be competitive against your other retailers around you. Then, as you apply different markups, you may sometimes find yourself in a position where you had a lot of items with lower markups in your store. So now when you try to buy certain items to compensate for these lower markups, maybe that your vendor give you a call and offer the very good items that you think are going to sell really well with really a good promotional cost prices. In that case, you're not going to apply the same initial markup, but you may apply a higher markup on this because your cost will be lower due to the promotional offer from the vendor. Even if you apply higher markup, you may be able to still charge a similar retail price as those similar items that you had in the store earlier. So you can afford to have high markups. In that case, the compensation for lower markups can be achieved through applying higher markups for these other items. So for whatever reasons, it is very likely that you will end up having a lot of different items which carry different percentage markups. So we feel the need to find some average markups, okay? Because we need to understand what's the average markup percent for the entire merchandise that we have in our store or the entire merchandise that we're dealing with. So we need to adjust the proportions of the merchandise that we purchase at different markups to be able to understand what is the markup that we currently achieved as compared to the markup goal that we had. So when we try to adjust the proportions of merchandise with the varying markups, that we call that as averaging markups, and the markup percentage that's calculated by averaging markups is called AMU percent or average markup percent. The AMU percent is obviously used as a markup goal in the planning process in a sense that we have a markup goal or AMU percent goal, and then as we actually make purchases, we continuously compare the average markup percent, AMU percent of the actual merchandise that we purchased to the planned AMU percent that we initially set as our goal. The average markup percent or AMU percent is expressed as a percent of total retail. As I said many times before, any markup percent is percent of certain retail, right? Initial markup was percent of original retail. Cumulative markup percent was percent of cumulative retail. And the maintained markup percent was percent of net sales, which was the actual retail that we applied to the merchandise that was sold. So now AMU percent, because this is the average markup of all merchandise that we have, that will be percent of the total retail of all merchandise that we're including in the calculation of this average markup. So given the famous concept of markup percent being R minus C over R, one of the three most important formulas I have emphasized, we're applying that in this context, the average markup context. That will be total retail. The R will be now total retail, and the cost will be total cost, the cost of everything that we have. So total retail minus total cost over total retail. I said earlier, and calculating average markup percent is basically adjusting proportions of merchandise purchased at different markups, right? So let's see this example. Let's take a look at this one example. Say I have two different groups of items, Okay, and I want to adjust the markup percent here, and each item group comes with a different markup percent. The first group, item A, had carried a markup of 33.33%, which is shown on the right, the far right column of the table, and item B carried a markup percent of 50%. Okay, now how do we adjust the proportion of these two different groups of merchandise items that we have? We have to look at the quantity. So item A, we have 144 units, okay? And these items were purchased at the unit cost of $8 each, and they're selling or retailed in our store at $12 each, okay? On the other hand, item B, we have 24 of them, 24 units, and the unit cost was $7, and unit retail price is $14, okay? If this is the case, then what would be the average markup percent? Okay, which basically means what would be the total retail minus total cost over total retail. Okay, the total retail total cost basically means the total retail of the total merchandise, including both item A and item B. Total cost is the entire cost that includes both item A and item B. Okay, so how do we do this calculation? Let's think about it for a second. So as you might have guessed by now, for us to be able to calculate the total retail of the total merchandise and total cost of the total merchandise, we need to first know the total cost and total retail of each item. Now what we know is the unit cost and unit retail, which means the cost and retail value of each item, each unit, right? But item A has 144 units, okay? So that means the total cost of item A will be 144 times $8, and the total retail of item A will be 144 times the unit retail of $12, right? So that way we can calculate $1,152 total cost for item A and $1,728 total retail for item A. Okay, we do exactly the same thing for item B, and that will be 168 for total cost of B and 336 for total retail of B. Okay, once we know the total cost and total retail of each of the item A and item B, then we should be able to calculate the total cost for the total, right? As well as total retail for the total. Well, we've done something like this before, right? And when we did a cumulative markup calculation, we had to calculate first cumulative retail and cumulative cost, and we added the cost of the all groups of merchandise together to get the cumulative cost and cumulative retail the same way, right? And we apply the same logic here, right? So we know that the cost and retail, total cost and total retail of item A and item B, then we're gonna just combine all the costs, right? So item A's total cost and item B's total cost together, that will lead to our total cost for the total merchandise, in this case $1,320. And we do exactly the same thing for the retail to get $2,064 retail. Okay. Now we have the total retail and total cost for the total merchandise, from which we can easily calculate the markup percent for total, which is what we call AMU percent, right? So total retail minus total cost over total retail would be the AMU percent. In this case, 2,064 minus 1,320 over 2,064 equals 36.05%, and that will be the AMU percent. Okay. Here, going back to the original discussion of item A carrying a 33.33% markup and item B carrying 50% markup, right? Between these two items, the average markup is not just adding 33.33 plus 50 and just divide that by 2. That is not the average that we're talking about here. We are taking a weighted average. Okay, we're considering adjusting the proportion of the merchandise, right, in terms of their quantity, and reflect that in our average markup calculation. Okay, so when we have like item A had 144, a whole lot more items or units of item A than the units of item B, right? Item A carried a lot lower markup than item B, so we had a lot more items with a low markup, okay, and less items with a high markup. That was the case that we're dealing with. As a result, our AMU percent is 36.05%, which is closer to the item A's markup percent because we had more item A's than item B. Okay. Okay, now let's take a look at this second example. This example setup is exactly the same as the previous example, except that now the quantity is flipped. Okay, now item A comes in 24 units, and we have 144 of item B. Okay, everything else remains the same. The unit costs are the same as the previous example. The markup percent for each item the same as the previous example. But the quantity is now becoming different. Okay, in that case, how is that going to affect our AMU percent calculation? Let's think about it. Let's work on this. Okay, pause the video here for a while to work on this problem. So we walk through the same process that we went through with the previous example. So first, calculate total cost and total retail for item A and item B by multiplying their quantity with their unit cost or the unit retail. So we got those numbers down. And then we add total cost of the item A and the total cost of item B to calculate total cost for the total merchandise. 1200 was the answer. For total retail, did the same thing. We got 2,304. Okay, and from these two numbers, we were able to calculate the AMU percent of 47.92%. Total retail minus total cost over total retail. Right? Okay. So which one, with example 1 and example 2, which one has a bigger AMU percent? Okay. We see that example 2 has a bigger AMU percent. Okay. Why is it that? Okay, that's because although their individual item groups markup percent, we use the same thing, but their quantity is now different. So now we have a more item B's than item A. In the previous question example, we had more item A than item B, right? Item B has a higher markup percent, right? So that when we have more item B than item A, now our AMU percent is going to be closer or similar to item B's markup percent than the item A's markup percent, right? So we can kind of see how we're actually adjusting the proportions of the merchandise in terms of their quantity to lead to the calculation of the AMU percent. And so the AMU percent is, in fact, it's a weighted average. It's not an arithmetic average. This slide, just to reiterate what I just said. Averaging markup does not mean you just average the markup percents of the various purchases, because that is not going to lead to the balance for the volume purchased at each of the different markups, right? So in the previous examples 1 and 2, if we just average markup percent of item A and item B, so that 33.33% of item A markup and 50% for the item B, and you just divide it by 2, that would have been 41.67. But neither example resulted in 41.67 as the final answer for the AMU percent, right? That's because we had to adjust the average markup based on the quantities, the volume of the different purchases that we made for different items. Okay, so let's practice calculation of the AMU percent with this practice problem. Okay, let's say we're a buyer and we visited 2 supplier showrooms today and placed a purchase with each one of them. Okay, let's see if we've met our markup goal of 54%. Let's say our AMU percent goal is 54%, and let's see what our actual AMU percent is and see if that matches our goal. Okay, from the first supplier, we bought 144 hiking shorts for $11 each, and so the $11 will be the unit cost for each of these hiking shorts, with the intent to retail them for $25 each. So $25 will be the unit retail of each of these 144 hiking shorts. From the second supplier, we bought 192 walking shorts for $12, again, the unit cost, to retail at $25. That's the unit retail. Okay, given this information, then how do we calculate AMU percent? You could probably do this calculation without having this kind of grid, but I strongly encourage you to use this type of setup. This is extremely useful. In this particular problem, we're just looking at two item groups. But if you think about realistically, if you were actually a buyer and going to the market to buy something, your store is going to deal with hundreds of SKUs, hundreds different kinds of items. And when you try to calculate AMU percent for this, like 100 different styles, for example, or like 20 different vendors items and things like that, it's not going to be possible for you to just do a hand calculation. You're going to have to develop certain spreadsheet. And this is the spreadsheet format that you need to use, and it's going to help you greatly in solving a lot of problems, not only to calculate AMU percent but also other problems that we're going to see later. Okay, so I strongly encourage you to utilize this setup to first plug in all the numbers that were given in the problem instruction, okay, and then try to solve the AMU, solve this problem for the AMU percent. Okay, here's the problem again. I'm assuming you're using the lecture notes. The lecture notes should have the setup that we just saw on the previous slide. So please utilize it, or if you don't have the lecture note in front of you, then draw one for yourself to solve this problem. Okay, let's pause the video here. Alright, take a look at the answer together. Okay, let's first kind of see how we set up the problem, right? The problem said that we had 144 hiking shorts from the first vendor. That unit cost was $11 and unit retail was $25. Okay, and from the second supplier, we bought walking shorts, 192 of them, at the unit cost of $12, and we're going to sell them at $25. Okay, so we've got quantity, unit cost, and unit retail columns completed. Okay. Now the question actually goes to the markup percent of the total merchandise, which is what we called here AMU percent. Okay, to find that answer, we're going to have to calculate total cost and total retail for each group of items, hiking and walking shorts, as well as the total cost and total retail for the total. Okay, so we multiply the quantity by the unit cost or unit retail to get the total cost or total retail, okay, for each group, and then you combine each group's total cost to get the total cost of the total, and do the same thing for total retail for the total, only using the retail prices and retail values. And then your final answer for the AMU percent will be the total retail minus total cost over total retail. In this case, 8,400 minus 3,888 over 8,400, which gave us a 53.71% AMU. So does that mean we met the markup goal or not? The problem said we had a markup goal of 54%. Now the AMU was calculated to be 53.71%. Okay, so did we meet the goal or not? We did not meet the goal because 53.71% is lower or smaller than 54%. Okay, although you may think, well, you can round it off to be 54, but no, that's not going to happen. 0.5%, 0.1%, 0.2%, all counts in terms of the markup, because we're not dealing with just $10, right, of merchandise. We're dealing with big numbers of a group of merchandise. In this case, it's 8,400 only, but in the reality, the store is going to deal with a lot of zeros, the numbers with a lot of zeros, right? So even 0.1% means pretty big numbers. dollar numbers eventually. So we want to be pretty accurate about when we evaluate our achievement, whether we met the goal or not. So in this case, for a 54% markup goal, we have achieved only 53.71% average markup. So technically, we did not meet the markup goal. Alright, this concludes Module 9 lecture. Let's not forget to work on Module Problem Assignment number 9. Thanks for listening.